the extreme weather that comes with climate change, some of these storms that were 500-year storms or whatever are now happening, multiple times a decade. And so we have to be able to adjust our thinking and to increase our resilience and our ability to sustain those kinds of impacts. What kind of investments does that mean? Well, it really depends.
Welcome to another edition of the CDA Institute's Expert Series podcast. In this episode, we spoke with John Conger about the impact of climate change and extreme weather events on military readiness, military installations, and military infrastructure. Conger speaks about the kind of investments needed to ensure the resilience of North American infrastructure in the 21st century, as well as the role of military installations in furthering climate resilience. John Conger is the Director Emeritus of the Center for Climate and Security, Senior Advisor to the Council on Strategic Risks, and Senior U.S. Advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. Mr. Conger also previously served as Director and Senior Policy Advisor with the Center for Climate and Security and is the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense at the U.S. Department of Defense. John, thanks for joining the CDA Institute's Expert Series once again. I'd like to kick off this discussion with a question about extreme weather events and their impact on Canadian American operations. So I'll get right into it. As extreme weather events become more commonplace, what will the impacts be for joint Canadian American operations, such as NORAD?
I think I want to clarify, there are going to be extreme weather events that happen more frequently, certainly, but not more frequently in all the same places. The weather is going to act differently. Hurricanes that might have always been in the American Southeast or in the Caribbean now more frequently will hit New England and Canada, where it was less common before. There's going to be different behaviors that we're going to see and we're going to have to respond to. There are systems that track in the U.S. government frequency of billion-dollar disasters, and we've seen those numbers increase significantly over time, and frankly, it's not going to stop increasing. Those kinds of things are going to go up. So as we contemplate what kinds of things we're going to have to respond to from a NORAD perspective or any U.S. or Canada or joint perspectives, we are going to have to learn to expect the unexpected, to plan for disasters to occur, and to be in a position both to respond to the disaster and to prepare for the disaster. Resilience is going to be important, which means when the disasters hit or when the various climate impacts hit, that we can, no pun intended, weather them better. But I think the other piece of this is a response piece. We have seen that with the disasters that occur, the military is increasingly seen as a tool in the toolbox of disaster response domestically, wildfires, and floods, and so on and so forth. The military has capabilities that are needed domestically in order to protect citizens across the board. I'm not sure if that was directly on point to what you were asking, but I think it's important context to put across.
How is increasingly extreme weather disrupting U.S. and Canadian military capabilities, missions, and operations? How might future environmental conditions impact DoD or DND's ability to maintain built and natural infrastructure, as well as ensure military readiness in the future?
I think it's important to think about the context here, whereas climate change affects the environment in which we operate across the board. And in some places, it's going to affect more, and in some places, it's going to have a smaller effect, and it's going to vary. But there isn't going to be a part of military operations that is untouched. And so whether that means the infrastructure that we maintain, that's certainly going to be affected. It's going to be affected differently depending on the location. I can tell you that I've seen whether it's extreme weather impacts, flooding impacts, drought limits operations, because sometimes you can't use live fire munitions in a drought situation because you might start a wildfire. But then again, we've also seen wildfires affect military installations and force people to evacuate. We also have requirements such as responding to wildfires to try and help put out the wildfire. And so that affects us in multiple ways. Training constraints are a big deal, whether that's heat or cold that we weren't expecting to have to deal with. We're going to have to learn how to operate in these environments. Ironically, with climate change warming the Arctic, it makes the Arctic more accessible, and so therefore we're going to have to ensure that we can operate in very cold weather because the terrain is going to be more accessible. But at the same time, we have to be able to operate in extreme heat. When our forces deploy to places like the Middle East, it is going to be increasingly common that our forces will encounter and our equipment will encounter temperatures that one would not normally consider to be healthy at all, but I mean, they would make a place uninhabitable. And so how do we continue to operate in those temperature extremes is going to be a serious question. There are going to be new areas in which to operate. So as the Arctic ice melts and the Arctic Ocean becomes more accessible, we're going to have an expectation that we're going to operate with surface ships in that area. We're going to have to be able to maintain domain awareness across the Arctic in order to operate in that environment. And so that's another piece of the puzzle that we just have to layer in. Climate change drives all of these things. So from the very tactical to fixed infrastructure to deployed operations and to the strategic, climate change shifts the environment in which we operate. So therefore, it shifts the way we operate.
What kind of investments can be made to ensure the resilience of security infrastructure in North America? How can militaries future-proof their installations to defend against 21st century threats, such as climate-related disasters?
So this is a function of reducing risk. We always make a calculation as to how to over-engineer or not the facilities that we build. If we are expecting a disaster is very, very unlikely, maybe we won't prepare for it. I like to use, asteroid impact as an example. We don't harden our facilities to asteroid impact. We don't expect it to occur. However, the extreme weather that comes with climate change, some of these storms that were 500-year storms or whatever are now happening, multiple times a decade. And so we have to be able to adjust our thinking and to increase our resilience and our ability to sustain those kinds of impacts. What kind of investments does that mean? Well, it really depends. It depends on whether you have a facility that's on the edge of on the edge of a forest, and wildfires will be in that area. You're going to have to invest in things like forest maintenance to make sure that the wildfires are less likely to come and impact your installation. You're going to have to make sure that you have energy resilience, because oftentimes power lines go through those forests, and that means that you're more likely to have a power outage at a critical installation. So you're going to have to make sure that your backup power systems are improved and capable of handling that kind of environment. And that's just one of multiple scenarios. I know that at installations in Alaska, there have been significant impacts by permafrost thaw. And so if your foundation's cracked because the permafrost thaws, and that undermines operations at particularly sensitive locations, say, for example, someplace where you store munitions, you're going to have to make investments to make those foundations more secure, to rebuild buildings and so on and so forth. I have to imagine that Canadian military facilities will have related challenges. Coastal installations where sea level is rising, what we will see first is recurring flooding, and that will be the signal that we're going to, that incidents will increase over time. You're going to want to make sure that piers are higher, that you're not building in floodplains, that your substations are not below sea level, a lot of the vulnerable systems tend to go to the energy systems. All of that, you're going to have to make sure that, first, do no harm. Anything new, you want to make sure you've thought through and have full expectation of the threats and the risks that are coming forward. But secondly, look at your critical emissions and make sure that the buildings that they're in are not particularly vulnerable, and that you shore those up. There's a wide range of things to be done, and it really depends on the specific location that you're examining. I'll give one other example. So back in 2013, the U.S. Congress told the Navy to do an assessment of its shipyards and to come up with a 20-year plan for where it needed to invest over time. The Navy came up with a $20 billion plan that would be for investments over a 20-year period across 4 key shipyards. And as it did that, near the top of the list of projects that were proposed were flood protections at the shipyard in Norfolk. The dry docks at that facility were not built to accommodate sea level rise. And so the Navy was increasingly concerned at the vulnerability of the nuclear submarines that were going under maintenance at that location. And when a nuclear submarine goes into maintenance, they cut it up into rings to do internal maintenance on the nuclear reactor and things like that. So in that environment, a flood would be catastrophic, and having insufficient flood protection would be catastrophic. So the flood, they came up with a project, I think it was $43 million, to invest in just increasing the flood protection, making the walls higher around that dry dock to be able to accommodate anticipated future flooding. That's the kind of thing you're going to look at, what assets are the most sensitive and the most vulnerable, and what are the investments I need to make at that particular location. But it's going to be mission justified, and it will depend from location to location, and somebody at the higher levels is going to have to prioritize that.
Could the U.S. leverage its international military education and training programs to ensure its allies and partners have the skills to responsibly manage climate-driven disasters?
Yes, I think that is an excellent approach. I think that those programs will allow the U.S. to engage on climate change in a way that supports the concerns of many of its partners, and that leverages the expertise that the U.S. military has developed over time. Because I think, in fairness, the U.S. military started looking at climate change a little bit earlier than a lot of its partner militaries did. Whereas on the domestic side, climate change may have been, those concerns may have been elevated in our partner nations before they were taken as seriously within the U.S. from a domestic perspective. The military is where it really got traction in the U.S. And so the U.S. military was a little bit ahead of the game. In that context, there's a lot they can share. There's a lot of thinking that's been going on resilience, and those kinds of partnership training programs will help not only to build capacity, but to sort of build the lines of communication on climate change in a constructive way. So yes, I think that's important. And I think whether that's the US and Canada building stronger links to talk about Arctic issues or deployments that we're going to do together, or to talk about NATO and how NATO is increasingly paying attention to climate change. But it could also be partnership with island nations in the Pacific to help them build resilience, because they're extremely concerned about sea level rise and the permanent loss of land that is critical to continuing to live on the islands they live in. So all of those, there's a range And those are only a couple examples of the range of places where this would be particularly valuable.
What role do military installations have in advancing climate resilience?
I think that military installations, let me back up a step. I would say this, that across the Department of Defense enterprise, certainly, it was the installations that really embraced the idea of dealing with climate change first. They were facing the nearest term challenges, and so took concrete steps forward to sort of manage that problem, whether it's flooding or wildfire, energy resilience to deal with storms and so on and so forth. The installations enterprise sort of really did lean forward on this. In that context, as we sort of think about the entirety of the populace, a lot of communities are starting to worry about this, but they don't have the resources of the Defense Department. And they are looking to figure out what they can do to weather the coming storms and how they are going to deal with the coming disasters and what they might need to do. How installations can help those communities is by being sort of innovation labs, figuring out what works and what doesn't work, but they're also helping to promote certain markets. I'll give you a key example. Microgrids are sort of these smaller, isolated grids separate from the overarching electric grid, where you can generate power within a fixed location and maintain the power on even when the larger grid goes down. In that context, DoD has invested a lot of money in microgrids. And some DoD officials have cited that DoD itself represents 1/3 of the global microgrid market. As such, they are driving that technology forward. They are driving the market and sort of propelling the building of capacity, so that when communities want to get their own microgrids, they will be doing it on the foundations of that initial defense investment. I think that you're going to see more and more of a desire for communities to have their own microgrids as well. So fundamentally, I think one of the things that people don't fully understand is the importance of planning. To think about the problems they've got facing them in the future, and to help that and to have that planning inform the investments they're making. I think that there is a lot of urgency around climate change, but the problem is that if people use the resources that are suddenly available to respond to that urgency, and they don't think through what they do with them, then we're going to have a lot of mistakes that we're going to have to make up for later. That you have to make sure you're thoughtful about the challenges you're going to be facing in the future, and to make sure that the investments are prioritized accordingly. Along the same lines, the Navy example that I used earlier in Norfolk, that was a study of investment and thought and thinking about the challenges facing infrastructure, key infrastructure, critical infrastructure, without focusing on climate change. And yet the climate change resilience priorities emerged from that holistic study. So I think if you start doing the planning with climate in mind, so it's climate informed, then those priorities will emerge and will be prioritized accordingly, even if the funding or the resources or the planning is not climate specific, if that makes sense. So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle to be able to incorporate, that these things will take time, but you're better off thinking them through and acting accordingly, and not expecting results tomorrow, but the results will come if you start the process now.